Welcome to our weekly Church on the Rock podcast. For more information, visit us at churchak.org, download our Church on the Rock AK app, or like us on our Facebook page. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy our weekly podcast.
We're in this Gen X series. Really what we're looking at is Genesis and Exodus, but we're taking the idea that each and every generation has an invitation from God to join him in what he's doing in the world, in his reconciliation work. And it's not new to our generations. It's actually been happening all the way since the beginning of the story with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Even with the sin that they find themselves in, God is still inviting them to join him in what he's doing. Because he is the master of taking our brokenness and crafting it into something beautiful. And that's true for every generation, each and every generation, even those of us who are Gen Xers, the generation that they didn't know what to do with us. We came along and they were like, we know the greatest generation, and we know the silent generation, and we know the baby boomers because there's lots of babies, but we don't know what to do with this generation. We're just glad that Ritalin has been invented. So that's my generation. How many of you are Gen Xers in the room? You can raise your hand, Pete. It's okay. We're not old. We're seasoned. But even my generation and your generation have an invitation from God to join him in what he is doing in the world. And this week, I want to look at something really specific. And over the next few moments, we're going to describe this journey that God takes all of us on from dysfunction to destiny. You know, it's true for every one of us. Like, I don't know all of your stories, but as I look around this room, I know the stories of many of you. I know the places of dysfunction that you found yourself in at one point in life, and you discovered that God was not done, he was not finished, whether it's the dysfunction in your home growing up or the dysfunction in your marriage or addiction or whatever it is. But God has been the master of taking people who find themselves in dysfunction and moving them to a place of destiny, because that's what he desires for every single one of us. And there is no character that I have seen that finds themselves in more dysfunction in the scriptures than Jacob. We looked at Jacob last week a little bit. We began digging into what was happening in his life and him supplanting his brother Esau and taking the birthright and all of those sorts of things. And that's Jacob's own dysfunction. And God's going to work that stuff out of him through a really painful process. But this week we're going to take a look at his marriage and what comes out of his marriage relationship. Remember the promise, Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. God has promised all the way back to Abraham that you will give birth to a nation. Out of you will come more people than the sand on the seashore, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your offspring. In other words, this promise isn't just for the Jewish people that will come later, but this promise is actually for all the nations of the earth. They will all be blessed because of what will come from you. And now in Jacob, we're actually going to see not just the birth of a child, a son, or a firstborn, or we're actually going to see the birth of a nation in the life of Jacob. But he's got to get hitched first. Now, if you like a good romance story, this one is not it. It starts off really good. In fact, this is the kind of story, the way it begins. One of my daughters in particular hates romantic scenes of any sort. Even the hint of a romantic scene, she will run out of the room screaming, "Help! Somebody help!" Like if two people are about to kiss, help! So, like, I'm not even exaggerating, and I love it. I'm like, if you could hold on to that desire to stay away from boys till 55, 60, we'd be doing good. But Jacob is on the run from his brother Esau, who he stole the birthright from, traded the birthright for a bowl of stew, and now Esau is really angry at Jacob because he's also stolen the blessing from his father. And so he is on the run, and he's headed to his uncle's house, Laban. And when he gets there, It's like the movie scene. He shows up at the well. He's thirsty, but he's not there by himself. Rachel is there. Genesis 29:15. Now, Laban had 2 daughters. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. There was no sparkle in Leah's eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. You can hear the contrast. Like, he's not saying her eyes weren't sparkly. He's like, she weren't pretty. Right? It's just a nice way of saying she did not have it going on. But Rachel, on the other hand, that's what Jacob thinks. Since Jacob was in love with Rachel, he told her father, I'll work for you for 7 years if you'll give me Rachel, your younger daughter, as my wife. Agreed, Laban replied. So Jacob worked 7 years to gain Rachel, but his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him but a few days. And all the ladies are like, oh. Like, whatever, dude. Like, it took 5 years for me to convince my father-in-law that I was good enough for Kitchery. I'm not saying I was good enough for Kitchery. I'm just saying it took 5 years to convince him that I could potentially be, right? Like, he's so in love that he is willing to put in the time for this relationship. And so 7 years fly by for him. He can see her across the field as he's taking care of the sheep and the goats. And he's like, this is why I'm doing this. Genesis 29, the 7 years have come. Genesis 29, 22 through 23. So Laban invited everyone in the neighborhood and prepared a wedding feast. But that night when it was dark, and it must have been really dark, Laban took Leah to Jacob, and he slept with her. But when Jacob woke up in the morning, it was Leah. No sparkle, Leah. What have you done to me, Jacob raged at Laban. I think Jacob might bear a little blame here, but anyways, I worked 7 years for Rachel. Why have you tricked me? And Laban goes on to describe the reason. This is the excuse he gives for this catastrophe. He says, in our custom, in our culture, it is always the older who marries first. So I had to give her away first. It's also true in Jacob's culture that the firstborn son gets the birthright, but he had supplanted the norm. And now that same thing comes back on his head. He is not at all happy about this, but he proceeds to let Laban know that, whatever, I will work another 7 years for the hot one. She's the one I wanted all along. I'll work another 7 years. And so Laban immediately gives Rachel also as Jacob's wife. And he proceeds to work for another 7 years. Now, I want to give this caveat. I gave it last week. It's worth giving again right here at this point in the story. And it's going to get worse, by the way. At this point in the story, to just let you know that because the Bible describes it does not mean the Bible prescribes it. Right? Often people get tripped up, they get hung up when they're reading stories, and all you're being told is the story. It's one of the things I actually love about the scriptures is that the scriptures don't sugarcoat it. They just tell you the whole story, the good, bad, and the ugly. You get all of it. They don't pretend like there are good guys and bad guys, because you're going to discover there's only one good guy in the whole story. His name's Jesus. But they tell you everything about the individuals. And so often when you're reading something, you could make the assumption that God must be okay with this. But if he is not okay with it in the rest of the scriptures, he wasn't okay with it there. It's not a prescription, it's just a description of what actually happened. Now, this sets in motion a very bizarre and awkward chain of events. Because while Leah might not be the hottie that Rachel is, Leah is a baby-making factory. And what you want in the day, in the culture, is you want sons to carry on your family name, your family line, to help work in the fields, to help expand your borders. And Leah starts having babies right away. In fact, if the competition is Leah versus Rachel, here's how it goes right out of the gate. Leah gives birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Those names may sound familiar to you, but she has 4 sons right away. And Rachel discovers that she is not able to have children. She is devastated by this, but she is not thwarted by it. She comes up with a plan. She's going to give Jacob her maidservant as his wife also, Bilhah. And so Bilhah and Jacob hook up, and Bilhah delivers, literally. Dan and Naphtali, thank you. I was glad somebody... what's going on with you guys? Dan and Naphtali are born, and then Leah stops having babies. She can't have any more babies, and so she's like, well, if that's what if Rachel's going to do, then I could do the same thing. I'll give him my servant, Zilpah, and then he can have babies with her. I told you, it's messy, it's awkward, and it's weird. But now Zilpah is in the picture, and she has 2 babies. Gad and Asher are their names. Now, if you think it's weird at this point, buckle up, Buttercup. Genesis 30, verse 14. You can see the score at this point. One day, during the wheat harvest, Reuben found some mandrakes growing in a field and brought them to his mother Leah. Rachel begged Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah angrily replied, wasn't it enough that you stole my husband? Now will you steal my son's mandrakes too? If I'm Jacob, I'm like, really? I've been reduced to being compared to mandrakes. Like, you took my husband. Are you also going to take my mandrakes? Rachel answered, I will let Jacob sleep with you tonight if you give me some mandrakes. So that evening, as Jacob was coming home from the fields, Leah went out to meet him. You must come and sleep with me tonight, she said. I have paid for you with some mandrakes that my son found. You talk about demoralizing. But I want you to think about it for a moment, because this is the same guy who traded a bowl of stew for a birthright, and now somebody's trading some mandrakes for a date night with him. You see what's going on here. And sure enough, Leah gives birth to 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun. And then finally, Rachel gets on the scoreboard, and Rachel has 2 sons. Rachel's firstborn son, the one Jacob loved, Rachel's firstborn son is named Joseph. And the last boy to be born is Benjamin, both to Rachel. Now, I don't know if you've put the pieces together yet, but there are 12 sons, and these are the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob will end up in a wrestling match with God, and in that wrestling match, he will be forever given a limp as a result, but his name will also be changed from Jacob to Israel. And this is the genesis of the nation of Israel. This hot, dysfunctional mess of a marriage is actually the very place from which God will bring his chosen people. You know why? Because he's the master of taking our dysfunction and bringing destiny from it. That's real good, is what that is. Like, he's doing this over and over. He's doing it in the life of Jacob. He's doing it in the life of Abraham. He's doing it in the life of Isaac. And now he's doing it with the nation of Israel, because he is in the process of redeeming this mess for his miracle, because he alone has the power to turn our blunders into his blessings. Which brings me to dysfunction to destiny. When you hear a story that you're familiar with, maybe like the story of Joseph, if you've been around church much at all, even if you haven't been around church, even if you've watched Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, like you've probably at least been familiar with parts of the story of Joseph in some way, and you know where the story ends up. And often when you know where the story is going to end up, you want to just skip the middle, Because the middle can be messy. The middle can be confusing. The middle can be challenging. And so you just want to get to the good parts of the story. We had a disco glow stick root beer float party 2 nights ago with my girls. And at the end of the party, in order to sort of bring everybody down from the sugar high, we decided to watch Clifford the Big Red Dog. Now, my kids have seen Clifford the Big Red Dog books, and they've seen Clifford the Big Red Dog cartoons. They know that Clifford has a long life and that he does lots and lots of things. But in the movie, it's the origin story for Clifford the Big Red Dog. And as you get partway into the story, like any good story, it has this climax where you get to the point, I don't know if the hero is going to make it. But you do. But every time, my girls go into panic mode. I can't handle it. I'm going to go in the other room. Tell me what happens. I'm like, girls, you know that Clifford lives. You can just make it through the middle because you know the miracle that's coming. You can endure. It's also why I hate shows like Lost. I don't know how many hours of my life were wasted fundamentally believing that they were going to tie all of these random things together miraculously at the very end. But spoiler alert, they don't. I will I ever watch it again. You know why? Because I endured the middle in hopes that the mess would be made sense of at the end, and they didn't. The whole time we're thinking these writers must be brilliant. They're going to bring all of these random, I can't figure out how to do it, and neither could they. None of it was real. It was purgatory. See you later. No, you will not see me later. If you ever write another show, I'm not watching it until I know what the end is first. I'm so mad. You know why? Because we want the middle to actually matter. We want the middle to take us somewhere because the middle is the place where all of this work is being done, should be being done, so that the miracle could be experienced. It's what happens in the middle that gives the miracle meaning. But the middle can be really messy. It's actually the reason I hate regrowing my beard. Now, I know for Paul Sliwa, this is a full beard, but this is actually me sneezing this morning. No, I hate it. The whole process of getting the beard back. I know some of you are sitting there just grinning at me with your big beards right now, but it's coming. I'm just telling you. You've seen it before. But I went to the mustache, weird Antonio Banderas thing, and now the process of growing the beard, but you got to shave this down a little bit. So once this gets long enough, it starts to match, and people just think your face is dirty. And then my wife said to me yesterday, "Oh, what? You're growing your beard back? When did you start?" And I'm like, "A year ago." No, at the beginning of this week. And it can be a messy. I just want to get to the end product, and that's what we would love. But it's actually the mess in the middle that gives meaning to the miracle. Without that, the miracle is meaningless. Now, I'm going to take you to the end of the story with Joseph, and then we're going to come back. But Genesis 50, this is the moment Jacob has been living with him in Egypt. They finally buried him. It's this huge entourage of all of the most powerful people in the land of Egypt that have gone to the funeral. And now they're on their way back, and his brothers are terrified that he's just been waiting for dad to die, but now he's going to pay us back. Genesis 50, verse 14, after burying Jacob, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had accompanied him to his father's burial. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. They didn't even go to him themselves. They sent a messenger, and the messenger comes with a lie to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, which you will not find anywhere in the text, by the way, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of the God of your father, beg you to forgive us. When Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all. Say all. All for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. This is the moment when you get to it, you're like, what? Like, that's powerful. That's forgiveness. That's reconciliation. But that moment is only powerful if you know the story. If you've seen the middle parts of the story, then that is a powerful moment. But that by itself might not be all that meaningful if it wasn't for where the story actually begins. And that is in the pit. Now he's in the palace, but it all started in a pit. In fact, his brothers are exceedingly jealous of him. They want him dead. Their father loves him because he was the one that was born to Rachel, and he loved Rachel, and Joseph is his favorite son. Genesis 37:2, listen to this dysfunction. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Yeah, that's right. He's that sibling. Right? Mom! He reported some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. And you can only imagine that Joseph made a point to wear it around. Like, I don't know if you've seen this. They're like, we hate you. We hate your robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night, Joseph had a dream. And when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. I just want to tell you a secret. Often those people who hate you or despise you or mock you for the dreams that God's given you, they often hated you before the dreams. They hated you because of the favor they saw in your life or the things that they heard that the Father was doing for you, but it's ultimately because your daddy's favor was on you. And this is just a cause to hate him all the more because he's begun having dreams about the future. So they make a plan, they dig a pit, and they put a price on his head. He's sold out of the pit into slavery, and he ends up in the house of the Potiphars. And the Potiphars are a well-to-do family, but Joseph quickly brings himself to the top of the pile by his integrity and by his service and by his work ethic. And so Potiphar puts him in charge of everything in his household. He is only second in command to Potiphar. And Joseph finds himself in a position of recognition, a position of power, a position of authority, but he is also in slavery. And often we can become comfortable short of the destiny that God's created us for. We could actually settle for bondage when we were created for freedom. We could actually settle for slavery when we're created for destiny because it can be really comfortable in slavery sometimes. Slavery to our addictions or slavery to our attitudes or slavery to our bitterness or slavery to you name it, fill in the blank. And Joseph could have settled right here and felt like this is it. This is as good as it's going to get. And then the moment comes when his integrity is tested. Potiphar's wife thinks he's a pretty good-looking young man, and so she wants him to come to bed with her. And in this moment, he has to make a decision. It's going to be 30 years from the pit to the palace, ultimately because there's a prison in between. But here's the lesson he will carry with him from Potiphar's house. If you settle for slavery, you will eventually sell out your integrity to salvage your security. You will end up doing whatever it takes to maintain the position or the power or the security you currently have, believing it's the best God has for you. And if you settle for slavery, you'll ultimately end up selling out your integrity to maintain your security. But Joseph does not do that. In fact, he ends up being falsely accused of rape and wrongfully imprisoned. And it's in prison where Joseph finds himself. In fact, Joseph is the first person in the scriptures that we're told is put in prison. But he is certainly not the last. In fact, if you found yourself in prison in the Bible, you were probably in pretty good company. You were in the company of people like Samson and like Jeremiah the prophet and John the Baptist and Peter and Paul and Silas and this dude named Jesus. Like they all ended up in prison at some point, wrongfully accused and placed there. But it's actually in prison where we're told that Samson's hair begins to grow long again and Samson's strength begins to return again and Samson cries out to the Lord from prison and actually defeats an entire nation in one moment from prison. It's in prison that Jeremiah receives the word of the Lord and the prophecies just flow out of him for the nation of Israel. It's actually in prison where John the Baptist gets to preach to King Herod. It's in prison where Peter finds himself face to face with an angel who's going to deliver him. It's in prison where Paul and Silas literally praise their shackles off their feet. Prison can be a powerful place. Because prison can be the place, that place of waiting, that place of delay, the meantime, the in-between time. It can be the place where God speaks to our character and our perspective. It's the place of waiting, the feeling of being held back. I've told you this story before, but I think it's worth repeating in this moment. It's my first youth ministry position. I had been waiting for this moment to arrive. What I've been waiting for is for the world to recognize my serious gifting and passion and drive. And I was in my first vocational ministry position in Lowell, Michigan, just outside of Grand Rapids. It was just me and my senior pastor, Bob, on staff. And I can remember coming into the office one morning and Bob saying to me, hey, this past Sunday, one of the church ladies stuck her fingers underneath the pew. You know what a pew is? Anybody? Pew? Okay, yeah. They were the orange ones, right? Most of them have been burned now. They're collector's items if you find them. But it stuck her fingers underneath the pew and stuck them in gum. That's right. Yeah. She couldn't even lift that hand in worship for the rest of the service. It was stuck right there. It was disgusting, and she had let him know that, and he was letting me know that my assignment was to take the paint scraper that he had brought with him to the church and to go out and lay down on the floor in the sanctuary and scrape the gum out from underneath the pews. Now, the cinnamon gum tasted good. The rest was just junk. But, I can remember so distinctly laying down underneath there and giving God a piece of my mind I couldn't afford to lose. Letting him know that this was not what I was created to do in the world. They didn't even have this class in Bible school. Right? God, you don't understand. This is not what I'm supposed to. Have you not heard me speak? And God so clearly coming back to me. I can remember verbatim what he said to me in my heart and my mind in that moment as I'm sort of lashing out about my time being wasted. God, why are you wasting my time? Jonathan, I never waste time. Stop wasting mine. God never wastes time because time is not a valuable commodity to God for his sake. It's a valuable commodity to God for our sake because we're stuck in time and space, and he utilizes time to shape our character. He never wastes it. But Joseph, at any moment along the way, in the pit, in Potiphar's house, or in prison, probably had the exact same thought. Why am I here? Why did you give me the dreams? Why did my father love me so much? Why do I feel like I was created for destiny and yet I find myself in all of this dysfunction? But God was not wasting a moment, and he was asking Joseph to not waste them either. But it can be frustrating when you're stuck in the mess in the middle, can't it? He is going to move from the pit to the palace, but right now he's in that place of waiting, that feeling of being held back. But that's because God is going to shape something in Joseph that is going to be critical for the good parts of the story. He's shifting his perspective. It shows up in Genesis 41, verse 50. Joseph is out of prison. He's now in Pharaoh's household, and he's now the second in command in all the kingdom of Egypt. Like he's in charge, large and in charge. And he's now in this position because God's given him a gift of interpreting dreams and visions and speaking prophetically. And so here he is in the house of Pharaoh, and he marries an Egyptian woman, and they begin to have children. Listen to the names of his first two sons, Genesis 41:50. During this time, before the first of the famine years, two sons were born to Joseph and his wife. Joseph named his older son Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. And Joseph named his second son Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. Joseph is actually identifying a process. He's saying in his firstborn son that God has given me Manasseh because he has caused me to forget the suffering and the pain and the wrong that was done to me. He has caused me to forget my father's house. He knows who his brothers are. He knows who his father is. He's not identifying that he can't remember their names or their faces. What he's identifying is he can't remember the offenses. Because you need to hear this. I need to hear this. It is impossible to bear fruit when you are poisoning the roots with bitterness and resentment and unforgiveness. And he says, God has healed all that junk. That's who Manasseh is. God has caused me to forget all the wrongs that were done to me. I'm not holding anything against them. I'm forgetting the offenders and I'm forgetting the offenses. I have forgiven those things. And when you do that, you can actually become fruitful wherever you find yourself, even in the land of your affliction. And he says, because I've been able to do that, because the Lord has taken me here, because I'm not poisoning my own roots, I have become fruitful in the very place where I am. It's irrelevant how I got here. The reality is he can make me fruitful in this moment because he is the God who takes us from dysfunction to destiny. But as long as you are poisoning the roots of your own destiny, you will never see the fruit of the harvest. He says, God has led me to a place of healing and wholeness and forgiveness and restoration. I've let all of that go, and what's happened as a result is that I have become fruitful in the very place that my grief began. Oh man, that's good. Like, you should have been like, somebody should be hitting the stage, you should be running around the room, like, come on, Pete. All right. Paul is counting on you. That's the reason I gave you that raise this year. I was like, 10 amens a service. He's been to the pit. He's been to the Potiphar's house. He's been to the prison. He's been to the palace. And now he's had his perspective shifted. And now the moment comes. The moment we were talking about earlier. This is the first time when he's going to reveal himself to his brothers. Now, you got to understand, Joseph is not the perfect guy. In fact, if you read the entire story, you will discover that he is very conflicted as to how to respond to his brothers. He tortures them for a little while, but he's actually trying to get some information. He wants to know if they've done the same thing to his other full brother, Benjamin, right? The other one that came from Rachel. He wants to know if Benjamin is still alive. He wants to know how his dad is doing. And so he's very hesitant to reveal himself just yet. But you can tell in the story he is wrestling with what to do with this moment that has presented itself. He could take vengeance in this moment. And eventually he lands on the conclusion. He decides what he is to do in light of everything that God has done for him. It's the moment they've dreaded because he's been rejected and he's been sold into slavery and he's been falsely accused and wrongfully imprisoned, but now he's in power. Genesis 45, verse 4, he says to his brothers, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. This is like the uh-oh moment. Like, we were hoping you had forgotten about that. Probably wasn't that big of a deal in your life. People in your life, they know what they've done. They're wondering when you're in power how you'll respond. They may be terrified of how they think you will respond, how you could rightfully respond. He says, but don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Not to make me wealthy, not to give me power. I'd much rather be at home with my family in the land that I know with the people that I love. But God is the one who actually sent me ahead of you. It doesn't mean you weren't wrong. It just means that he has the power to redeem all things. But he sent me ahead of you to save you. That is the message of the gospel. That what we intended for evil, he actually intended for good, that many might be saved. He goes on to reiterate this. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all Egypt. Are you picking up on a theme? Because this is a perspective shift. This is what happens when you deal with the poison in the roots, is that the fruit that comes out is actually fruit that is a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And Joseph is a picture of Jesus. You intended it for evil. Had the principalities and powers known what was going to happen as a result of the cross, they would have never sent Jesus to the cross. And if the enemy had known what was going to happen as a result of Joseph being thrown in the pit and being in the house of Potiphar and being thrown into prison, if the enemy had known that it was going to end up all the way over here rescuing the very people that he was trying to destroy since the beginning of the book, he never would have sent Joseph down that road. But God knew. God was orchestrating events, and if Joseph would live right in the mess of the middle, if he would trust God in the mess in the middle, he would experience dysfunction to destiny. That's the moment he finds himself in now. But that's not even the end of the story. Like, it actually gets a whole lot better, and we don't get a whole lot of detail, but we do get this. Genesis 50, verse 22 and 23. So Joseph and his brothers and their families continued to live in Egypt. Joseph lived to the age of 110. Like, I know one person, Pastor Dale. Just kidding. 100, and can you imagine, because you've got grandkids now, right? Here's what happens. Joseph gets to see his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren and his great-great-grandchildren born. Those first 39 years of his life, the mess, the dysfunction, the prison, the pit, all of that, that isn't even half of his life. He's got these first 39 years, let's just call it 40 years, and he is going to have another 70 years of the good stuff. What if in your situation the first 30 years are just God preparing you for your fabulous 40s, for your fantastic 50s, for your sick 60s, for your stellar 70s, all the way up to 110. I know none of us want to live to be that old, but what if we did and we were healthy? Like, what if God took this season of your life and it was just in preparation for the good stuff, and the good stuff just blew everything else away? But you only get the miracle if you will embrace him in the mess. He can take our dysfunction and turn it into destiny. And there are 2 things you need for that journey from dysfunction to destiny: trust and tenacity, faith and perseverance. Because without those, you will give up. Without those, you will begin to believe that God actually isn't good, that his intentions aren't good, that this is too bad to be redeemed. And yet what you discover in the scriptures, there is nothing that is too bad to be redeemed. He may not intend for it all to happen, but he does have an intention for who you are going to become. But if you get frustrated in the middle, if you lose faith and trust in the middle, then you will never experience what he has for you in that place of destiny. Because in the middle, it requires trust and it requires tenacity to hold on and to not let go. I love the way the psalmist describes it. He says, "In God I trust, so why should I be afraid? What can mere mortals do to me?" It's like you're Superman, right? What could mere mortals do to me? Like that kind of boldness that if God is at work, if he's in the mix, then the enemy doesn't have a strategy that could break his purposes in your life. But he does want to break off the bondage. He wants to set you free to quit poisoning your own roots so that you could experience the fruit that he has for you. That's a good word, Pastor. Thanks for saying that. You're welcome. Because it's true for all of us. He's moving you and he's moving me from those places of dysfunction to the places of destiny that he has created us for. If you would but trust and hold fast. Would you stand with us? I love this verse in Psalm 52, verse 9. He says, "I will praise you forever." And I mean that. I don't mean like forever now until it gets hard. I'm going to praise you forever, O God, for what you have already done. I will trust in your good name in the presence of your faithful people. I just want to tell you, and this is something that delights me when it comes to my kids. I didn't grow up as a PK, as a pastor's kid. I would have made a perfect pastor's kid by the way I lived life. I mean, I would have made a hot mess of things, but I didn't grow up as a pastor's kid, and I'm raising pastors' kids. It's going to be a real challenge sometime, but what I knew from the very beginning is I wanted them to grow up believing that God's people were faithful, that God's people were good, that God's people were generous. And I want to raise them up in a place where they get to see that. But you know what they really need is they need me to show them that. Because if I spend all my time frustrated with the things that can be irritating, and there are things that can be irritating, with the disappointments, with backstabbing, if I spend all my time living there and focusing on that, what I will communicate to my kids is that that's what God's people are like, and you're not. I'm not. I know we're a mess, but I just want to tell you, I get to tell my girls, somebody just paid for our meal, and we don't even know who it is. Like, they totally surprised us with it. Somebody just gave us this gift, and we don't even know who it is. Like, you, God's people, are so faithful in what you communicate to one another when we love and care for and bless one another in those ways, is that this is the place, uniquely on all the earth, that I get to experience the heart of the Father. I'm going to spend my whole life celebrating God's faithfulness, his goodness, and I'm going to do it in the midst of his faithful people. Every now and then, you and I just need to look around a little bit to find the good and to discover that he is at work right here, right now, in this moment.
Thank you for listening. For more of our podcasts and to discover how you can connect, visit us at churchak.org or download our Church on the Rock AK app from either iTunes or Google Play.